It was an ordinary morning in St. Mary Mead, at least, at first glance. The village lay wrapped in a hush of English tranquility, the early mist clinging to the hedgerows as the church bell tolled 9. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the Bluebell tea room, mingling with the crisp air along the main lane. Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Harnell, their wicker baskets in hand, lingered by the grocer's display of apples, exchanging their usual pleasantries. Terribly chilly for this time of year, Mrs. Bartlett declared, tugging her shawl more securely around her plump shoulders. Miss Harnell, a retired governess with notoriously strong opinions on the decline of modern manners, gave a stiff nod. Unseasonably so. And have you heard? Whatever shocking tidbit was about to be shared was abruptly cut short by the breathless arrival of young Nancy, the grocer's assistant. She burst from the shop, pale-faced and wide-eyed. "It's Mr. Abbott," she gasped. "They found him dead." A stunned silence fell over them, as though the village itself had drawn a sharp breath. Then, like ripples spreading from a dropped stone, hushed whispers began to flow outward. St. Mary Mead had not seen a true scandal in years until now. By the time Miss Marple arrived at Abbott's cottage, Constable Henry Graves already looked harried. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a sigh, adjusting his cap. "I should have known you'd come poking about." Miss Marple, the very picture of innocent curiosity, clasped her hands neatly in front of her woolen coat. "Oh, Henry dear, I was simply taking a little walk. It's all very distressing, you know, poor Mr. Abbott." Graves exhaled heavily, flipping through his notebook with the air of a man who wished this morning's burden had fallen on someone else's shoulders. "Looks like natural causes," he muttered. "Found in his chair, peaceful." Miss Marple arched a delicate brow. "Peaceful?" Graves hesitated. "Well, no sign of struggle. But there was something odd." Miss Marple waited, her fingers lightly knitting the air. Graves sighed. "Someone left a playing card. The King of Hearts. Right on the table next to him." Her sharp blue eyes gleamed. "Oh, my dear Henry," she murmured, "I do believe you'll find this was no natural death at all." Graves gestured vaguely at his notes, exhaling through his nose. "Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's something." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but a glimmer of sharpness flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, I rather think, Henry," she said thoughtfully, "that it is something." A moment later, she rose, smoothing the front of her skirt. "Well, I shan't take up any more of your time, you have so many important things to attend to." She smiled sweetly, a smile that had the curious effect of making Constable Graves sit up a little straighter. As she made her way toward the door, he called after her. "Miss Marple, you're not planning on getting involved in all this, are you?" She paused, tilting her head slightly. The light from the window caught the silver strands in her neatly styled hair. "Henry, dear," she said gently, "I wouldn't dream of it." And with that, she stepped out into the crisp air of St. Mary Mead, her mind already ticking away like a well-oiled clock. She had every intention of getting involved. Miss Marple's sitting room was a small, cozy haven of quiet reflection, scented faintly of lavender and beeswax. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the room. To an outsider, it was a picture of genteel domesticity, floral china arranged just so, bookshelves neatly stacked, and knitting basket always within arm's reach. But those who knew her well understood that this room was also a place of contemplation, where more puzzles had been solved than in the whole of the St. Mary Mead police station. She sat at a small escritoire, her hands resting lightly on an old, leather-bound village registry, its pages yellowed with age. A notepad lay beside it, already bearing a few neat annotations. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared to be indulging in a harmless afternoon of reminiscing. In reality, her mind was quietly turning over details, sifting through anomalies with the precision of a master watchmaker. Crime was not, after all, a matter of theatrics. Strip away the drama, and what remained was always the same, human nature. Greed. Fear. Secrets buried beneath polite smiles. The murder of Peter Abbott, an unremarkable schoolmaster, bore the hallmarks of something deeply personal, carefully disguised as something impersonal. She turned a page, tracing her finger over the elegant script listing St. Mary Mead's past inhabitants. The village's history was full of small intrigues, quiet feuds, and hushed scandals, the kind people chose to forget until circumstances forced them to remember. Then her finger paused. A name. Rupert Abbott. The surname was no coincidence. The year listed was 1879. Next to it, a brief but telling note. Scandal at the vicarage. Rupert Abbott dismissed from parish post. A quiet disgrace, buried by time, but not by her. She closed her eyes, sifting through long-ago whispers. The vicar's son, caught in some indiscretion. A scandal so profound that the family had quietly relocated, their disgrace swallowed by the past. Could this be connected? A shadow cast over the present, its roots tangled deep in old wounds. Her gaze drifted to her notepad, where she had already scribbled 2 words. King of Hearts. An unusual signature for a murderer. People left messages at crime scenes for all sorts of reasons: arrogance, the need to be understood, but a playing card, especially that one, was more than a flourish. It was a message. And then, unbidden, a nursery rhyme surfaced in her memory. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen, she wept, the Knave, he fled, and ne'er was seen again. She sat back, pressing her fingertips together. She had heard it so many times as a child, sung absent-mindedly in village halls, recited in sing-song voices by nursemaids. A stolen tart. A weeping queen. A vanishing knave. A tale of betrayal and punishment. Her thoughts shifted back to Peter Abbott, a quiet man, living alone. The kind no one would think to harm. And yet, someone had. Deliberately. With purpose. She snapped the book shut and reached for her cup of tea, only to find it had gone cold. This was not a crime of passion. Nor was it one of opportunity. No, this was something far more deliberate. A reckoning, long in the making. And when the roots of a thing were tangled, well, that was when it became truly dangerous. It was always best to seek out those who had tended the soil before. Miss Marple closed the village registry with a thoughtful hum, smoothing the front of her skirt before placing the book back on the shelf. There were a few avenues of inquiry to pursue, but first, a visit to Dolly Bantry was in order. And perhaps, she mused, a small detour past the church records on the way. Dolly Bantry's house, the Grange, was a handsome yet slightly sprawling country residence, one that had long since settled into the comfortable disarray of an estate too large for its current occupants. It was the sort of place where furniture had been collected rather than arranged, where the scent of lavender polish never quite managed to banish the lingering trace of cigar smoke from a husband who, despite being retired, still treated his study as a gentleman's club. The house had seen its fair share of scandals, nothing outrageous, of course, but the kind of whispered village tales that grew richer with time. And Dolly Bantry, ever irrepressibly curious and keen-eyed, had always been at the heart of them. Miss Marple arrived to find Dolly herself standing in the doorway, framed against the entrance in a smart tweed skirt and a floral blouse, her grey-streaked curls pinned back in the practical fashion of a woman who had once had housemaids but now made do with a harried cook and occasional gardener. "My dear Jane," Dolly called out brightly as Miss Marple stepped from the hired cab. "You've come just in time. I was about to endure a very dull tea alone, and you know I despise being left to my own company. It only leads to dreadful thoughts. Usually about house repairs." Miss Marple smiled, stepping onto the gravel path. "And here I thought I was merely paying a social visit. But if I can rescue you from contemplating leaking conservatories, I shall consider my afternoon well spent." Dolly looped her arm through Miss Marple's as she led her inside. "Oh, heavens, yes. Arthur insists nothing is wrong with the roof, but I know for a fact that rain is getting in somewhere. And I do so hate it when he pretends not to hear me." The drawing room was a bright yet slightly cluttered space where books, dog-eared magazines, and ornamental porcelain fought for dominance over polished mahogany surfaces. A large fireplace, unlit for now, was lined with decorative vases, while a set of floral chintz armchairs, slightly worn but immensely inviting, sat near a tea tray that had already been arranged with delicate china and an exceedingly generous plate of scones. Whether Dolly had anticipated Miss Marple's visit or was simply always prepared for unexpected company was impossible to say. Without preamble, Dolly poured the tea and settled into her chair with a knowing smile. "Oh, Jane. I suspect you haven't come just to discuss Arthur's selective hearing or my failing roof. This is about poor Peter Abbott, isn't it?" Miss Marple, already stirring her tea, did not look remotely surprised. "I thought you might have heard. My dear, you know this village." Dolly let out a wry chuckle. Of course I've heard. It's been the talk of the morning. And if I had a penny for every theory being whispered in the baker's queue, I could probably fix the entire roof in gold leaf. Mrs. Bartlett is quite convinced he was poisoned, you know. Miss Marple took a thoughtful sip of tea. Mrs. Bartlett has always had a rather morbid imagination. She's read far too much Wilkie Collins. Dolly grinned. And then there's the matter of the playing card. Dolly tapped a finger against her teacup. Now, Jane, even you must admit that's rather odd. Not odd, Miss Marple corrected, setting her cup down with care. Deliberate. Dolly leaned forward, intrigued. So, you do think it means something? Miss Marple gave her a patient look. People rarely trouble themselves to leave behind such theatrical clues unless they mean to say something. The challenge is deciphering what that something is. Dolly's brow furrowed in thought. You know, it reminds me of something, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Some old village tale, a scandal, I think, though goodness knows we've had plenty of those. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. You wouldn't be thinking of the Robert Abbott affair, by any chance? Dolly's eyes widened. Why, yes. That was it. Robert Abbott, wasn't he the vicar's son? There was some dreadful business, wasn't there? And then he just disappeared. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag resting untouched beside her. Indeed. He left the village in disgrace after an unfortunate incident, shall we say, a misappropriation of funds. There were whispers, of course, but nothing was ever proven outright. The family never spoke of it again. And now, all these years later, Peter Abbott is found dead with a playing card at his side, one that happens to correspond to an old nursery rhyme about betrayal. Dolly tapped her cup again, her expression sharpening. Oh, that is interesting. Do you think someone's dredging up old grievances? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Grievances in villages, my dear, are like dandelion seeds. They may scatter, but they always find a way to take root again. Dolly pursed her lips. And do you think dear Henry Graves has any idea what's really going on? Miss Marple's expression held the sort of patience reserved for exasperating but well-meaning men. Henry Graves is a competent constable, but he is looking for a crime with an immediate and logical explanation. What we have here, I suspect, is something rather more layered. Dolly, never one to resist a good mystery, sat forward eagerly. Well, Jane, it sounds like you need some fresh perspectives. Who do you plan to speak with next? Miss Marple's smile was polite, but there was something keen behind it. Oh, I think a few discreet conversations are in order. There are always those in the village who remember things they were never meant to. And then, of course, there's the matter of the next move. Dolly frowned. The next move? Miss Marple reached for her tea again. My dear, when someone begins something, they rarely stop at just one step. If this is about vengeance, or justice, or even a game, then I do not believe Peter Abbott will be the only unfortunate soul caught up in it. Dolly sat back, letting the weight of that settle. Oh dear. That does sound rather ominous, Jane. Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea. Indeed, Dolly. And I rather think we mustn't waste any time. The fire crackled softly in the grate, its warmth at odds with the quiet chill that had settled between them. Outside, St. Mary Mead basked in the golden glow of early evening, its hedges neatly clipped, its cottages standing proud, its people bustling about their ordinary lives. And somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, was a murderer. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Grievances in villages, my dear, are like dandelion seeds. They may scatter, but they always find a way to take root again. Dolly pursed her lips. And do you think dear Henry Graves has any idea what's really going on? Miss Marple's expression held the sort of patience reserved for exasperating but well-meaning men. Henry Graves is a competent constable, but he is looking for a crime with an immediate and logical explanation. What we have here, I suspect, is something rather more layered. Dolly, never one to resist a good mystery, sat forward eagerly. Well, Jane, it sounds like you need some fresh perspectives. Who do you plan to speak with next? Miss Marple's smile was polite, but there was something keen behind it. Oh, I think a few discreet conversations are in order. There are always those in the village who remember things they were never meant to. And then, of course, there's the matter of the next move. Dolly frowned. The next move? Miss Marple reached for her tea again. My dear, when someone begins something, they rarely stop at just one step. If this is about vengeance, or justice, or even a game, then I do not believe Peter Abbott will be the only unfortunate soul caught up in it. Dolly sat back, letting the weight of that settle. Oh dear. That does sound rather ominous, Jane. Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea. Indeed, Dolly. And I rather think we mustn't waste any time. The fire crackled softly in the grate, its warmth at odds with the quiet chill that had settled between them. Outside, St. Mary Mead basked in the golden glow of early evening, its hedges neatly clipped, its cottages standing proud, its people bustling about their ordinary lives. And somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, was a murderer. Arthur gave a short chuckle. You're not wrong there. He set down his glass with a small clink. As it happens, I have heard a thing or two. People talk when they think you're not paying attention. Dolly leaned forward eagerly. Go on, Arthur. He exhaled through his nose as though irritated by the obligation to contribute, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eye nonetheless. Well, for one thing, Peter Abbott wasn't quite as dull as everyone seems to believe. Miss Marple's fingers stilled for the briefest moment over the edge of her knitting. Oh? Arthur nodded. Had a word with Tom Mullins, owns the tobacconist. He said Abbott was seen arguing with a woman last week. Middle-aged, well-dressed, not from the village. And, according to Tom, Abbott looked like he'd just been given a rather nasty shock. Dolly's eyes widened. A woman? How very interesting. You don't suppose it could have been some old love affair? Arthur shot her a flat look. For God's sake, Dolly, not everything is a love affair. Miss Marple, however, did not dismiss the notion so easily. Did Tom Mullins happen to hear anything of the conversation? Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but intent. Arthur took another sip of his whiskey. Only bits and pieces, something about what was owed and keeping quiet. He set the glass down with a soft clink. Not exactly the usual pleasantries. Dolly let out a slow breath. Well, that is suggestive, isn't it? Someone from his past, perhaps. A debt? Miss Marple was thoughtful. Or a secret he was meant to keep. Arthur gave a short nod. That's what I was thinking. And it does rather tie into something else I heard. Dolly, who had just raised her teacup to her lips, paused mid-motion. There's another thing. Arthur leaned back in his chair. Old Finch, you know, the one who's always grumbling about how the village was better before they put up the new post office, was muttering about something peculiar the other day. Swears he saw a man lurking outside Peter Abbott's house a few nights ago. Tall chap, dark coat, kept to the shadows. Miss Marple adjusted the wool in her lap. And when exactly was this sighting? Arthur tapped his fingers against the chair arm. 2 nights before Abbott died. A brief silence followed, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Dolly was the first to speak, her voice hushed but urgent. Jane, that can't be a coincidence. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her eyes gleamed with thought. No, Dolly, I rather think it isn't. Arthur took another measured sip of whiskey. Seems to me this business isn't as cut and dried as Henry Graves would like to believe. Miss Marple gave him a rare approving nod. I quite agree. She paused, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. A woman who speaks of debts in silence, a man who watches from the shadows, and a playing card left behind. She trailed off, but her mind was already piecing it together. As if to tell us something, Dolly murmured, giving an exaggerated shiver. It's all very dramatic, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Murder usually is. Arthur let out a weary sigh. Well, if you ask me, there's something else you're both overlooking. Dolly frowned. Oh? And what's that? Arthur gave them both a long, knowing look before stating simply, the fact that if someone's gone to all this trouble, they are not finished yet. A hush fell over the room. Outside, the gardens of the Grange stretched lazily under the late afternoon sun, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and neatly clipped hedges. Somewhere beyond, in the heart of the village, a dog barked, a short, sharp sound that broke the silence before it settled again. Miss Marple, watching the slow swirl of tea in her cup, murmured almost to herself, "No, I rather think they are not." The Bluebell Tea Room was, in many ways, the beating heart of St. Mary Mead, at least for those who preferred their gossip served alongside a generous slice of Victoria sponge. Tucked neatly between the greengrocer's and the post office, it was a small but well-kept establishment, its lace-curtained windows perpetually fogged from the warmth inside. On this particular afternoon, deceptive in its tranquility, Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry took their usual seats near the counter, a prime position for observing without being too obviously observed. The room hummed with quiet chatter, the delicate clink of porcelain punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Mrs. Broom, the tea shop's stout and formidable proprietress, bustled between tables, balancing trays of teapots and scones with remarkable efficiency. Miss Marple stirred her tea with quiet precision, her gaze drifting from table to table. To the casual onlooker, she might have appeared to be nothing more than an elderly woman enjoying an afternoon treat with an old friend. But, as always, she was listening. "I must say," Dolly began, breaking off a piece of shortbread, "this business with Peter Abbott has set the whole village on edge." Before Miss Marple could respond, a conversation at the next table caught their attention. "Always said there was something odd about him," muttered Mrs. Bartlett, who was holding court with her usual circle of cronies. Miss Marple, without so much as lifting her head, continued to stir her tea, her expression serene, her ears keenly attuned. "A man who keeps to himself like that, mark my words, there's always a reason." Miss Harnell, a retired governess with an unshakable fondness for moral indignation, gave a sniff of disapproval. "And I heard from young Nancy at the grocer's that he had visitors at odd hours. Not local folk." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Foreigners." Dolly rolled her eyes and muttered, "Oh, for heaven's sake." As if having a visitor makes one a criminal. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful. Visitors at odd hours. A man who largely kept to himself. And now a playing card left at the scene of his death. Mrs. Bartlett, ever eager to be the bearer of intrigue, leaned in toward her companions. Her voice dropped to a whisper, though not so low that it wouldn't carry across the tea room. "And then there's the matter of the money." A hush fell over the table. Even Mrs. Broom, passing by with a fresh pot of Earl Grey, seemed to slow her stride ever so slightly. Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea. Ah. Now they were getting somewhere. "Money?" Miss Harnell asked, her eyes narrowing with interest. Mrs. Bartlett gave a sage nod. "Bank clerk told my cousin, well, my cousin's husband, if we are being precise, that Peter Abbott had been making rather large withdrawals lately. And all in cash." The reaction was immediate. Miss Harnell gasped. "Well, that's highly irregular." Mrs. Sweeting, who had thus far remained silent, cleared her throat hesitantly. "If I remember correctly, there was another Abbott involved in money trouble some years ago." Miss Marple gently set her teacup down. "Rupert Abbott," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard. Every head at the table turned toward her. Mrs. Bartlett pursed her lips. "Well, yes, now that you mention it." "Now that you mention it," Mrs. Bartlett leaned in, her eyes narrowing as if recalling something long buried. "Didn't Rupert Abbott leave the village under questionable circumstances?" Mrs. Bartlett nodded vigorously. "Oh, most certainly. It was quite the scandal in its day. He was the vicar's son, you know, people trusted him." Miss Harnell gave a sharp sniff. "And what did he do?" "Betrayed that trust, didn't he?" "Money went missing from the church fund, wasn't it?" Mrs. Sweeting added, though she hesitated. "But there was never any real proof, only whispers." Mrs. Bartlett scoffed. "That's because he ran off before anyone could prove a thing. A guilty conscience if I ever saw one." Dolly, tapping a fingernail against her plate, tilted her head thoughtfully. "And now, years later, another Abbott dies under mysterious circumstances. It does make one wonder." Mrs. Bartlett, emboldened, gave a knowing nod. "Perhaps someone never forgot what Rupert Abbott did." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. The village had a long memory, that much was certain. Grievances were never truly forgotten, not in St. Mary Mead. No, this was no crime of impulse. This was something older. Something deeply rooted. And she suspected it was far from over. The morning air was crisp, holding that peculiar stillness that comes when autumn lingers on the edge of winter. Wrapped in a sensible wool coat, Miss Marple made her way through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead, walking with the quiet determination of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing what others overlooked. Peter Abbott's cottage stood at the end of a small lane, neatly kept, utterly unremarkable except for the fact that its occupant had been found dead in his chair, a playing card laid deliberately in front of him. The King of Hearts. Miss Marple had encountered many peculiar things in her time, and she had long since learned that while murderers might be foolish in their crimes, they were rarely careless in their symbols. The cottage interior remained eerily undisturbed, too neat, too deliberately arranged. A small fire had been set in the grate. A tea service sat untouched on the sideboard. A book of poetry lay open on the table, as if its reader had only stepped away for a moment. As if Peter Abbott had expected company. Henry Graves, the village constable, had been reluctant to let her in. But he had learned the futility of refusing Miss Marple access, so he grumbled but obliged. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her keen eyes sweeping the room. Yes. Murderers were rarely careless. And whoever had done this was trying very hard to tell a story. At first glance, one might have thought Peter Abbott had simply drifted into death, peaceful and unremarkable. But then there was the card. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the polished wood of the table where it had been placed, deliberate, unmistakable. Not a flourish of whimsy, nor a careless afterthought. This was a message. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf, scanning the orderly rows of well-worn spines. Dickens, Tennyson, a collection of travelogues, standard fare. And yet, something stood out. A slim, battered volume, half hidden behind the others. She pulled it free and opened the cover. Nursery rhymes. The pages were creased, well-thumbed, and as she leafed through, one particular verse caught her eye. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen, she wept, the Knave, he fled, and ne'er was seen again. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the page. A stolen tart. A weeping queen. A fleeing knave. Betrayal. A crime. A disappearance. She closed the book thoughtfully. No, this was not just a murder, it was a story, told in fragments and symbols. And it was far from over. Peter Abbott's cottage was only the first piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple's next stop was the home of Mrs. Alice Pendleton. Unlike Abbott, Mrs. Pendleton was still very much alive, but she had been at the center of another peculiar incident just a fortnight ago. A break-in. Drawers ransacked. Letters disturbed. Nothing stolen. Or so Mrs. Pendleton had insisted. Nothing of value, my dear, she had said at the time, shaking her head. But Miss Marple had seen something in the woman's eyes, a flicker of unease. Because Mrs. Pendleton was not the sort to misplace things. And she was certainly not the sort to forget a slight. Now, standing once more in the woman's parlor, Miss Marple reconsidered. The room was as neat as ever. No real signs of disorder, only the careful suggestion of it. A misplaced trinket. A chair nudged just slightly askew. And then, the napkin. A single folded napkin had been left on the sideboard the night of the disturbance. At first glance, it had seemed unremarkable. But now, as Miss Marple studied it more closely, she noticed something she had missed before. The embroidery along its edges. A delicate crown. A peculiar detail. An odd thing to take note of. Unless, of course, it meant something. The third stop, the church archives. Miss Marple gathered her coat around her as she made her way through the crisp morning air, her mind weaving connections, filling in the gaps. Yes. This was no mere coincidence. This was a trail, carefully laid. And she was beginning to see where it led. Miss Marple's final stop was not a crime scene, but it held its own quiet secrets. The parish archives, a dusty chamber tucked behind the church offices, smelled of old parchment and candle wax. Few ever disturbed this place, an occasional historian tracing family lines, or the vicar searching for a long-forgotten baptismal record. Miss Marple, unassuming as always, had excused herself from the usual village chatter and settled at a narrow wooden desk beneath the weak glow of a flickering gas lamp. Mr. Wentworth, the vicar's young assistant, had granted her access with little fuss, though not without a flicker of curiosity when she inquired about records from the late 1800s. Just a bit of genealogical research, she had said with a pleasant smile, folding her hands neatly over her handbag. In truth, it was not a lie. The dead often told more stories than the living if one only knew where to look. Her gloved fingers traced the worn spines of the heavy ledgers before selecting one bound in cracked leather. With the precision of someone well-versed in careful investigation, she leafed through the fragile pages, her eyes skimming over births, deaths, land disputes, and, of course, scandals. And then, she found it. Rupert Abbott. His departure from the village had been swift. No formal charges. No trial. Only a terse entry. Left the parish in haste. Dispute over accounts. No further record. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, tapping a finger against the wooden desk. No further record, except there was. A later entry, written in the same careful hand, caught her eye. A birth. A child. Father, unknown. The past was never truly buried. It lingered in ledgers, in whispered half-truths, in the kind of wounds that time did not heal. A playing card left at a murder scene. A stolen tart. A queen who wept. A knave who fled. The symbols had begun to align, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. And she had the distinct, uneasy feeling that this story was not yet finished. Miss Marple turned the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the fragile parchment. Then there it was. Rupert Abbott. The entry was brief. Too brief. Almost as if someone had wanted to erase him from the record. Dismissed from post. Left for London. No further mention. Miss Marple pursed her lips. A vicar's son departing under a cloud was no small thing, not in a place like St. Mary Mead, where memories ran deep and grudges even deeper. That he had disappeared so completely suggested something far more serious than mere indiscretion. She turned another page, following an instinct she had long learned to trust. And there, beneath a separate entry, years later but unmistakably connected, she found another Abbott. A birth. A child. Mother, unknown. Father, no record. Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful sound. A child hidden in the parish records, tied to a scandal long buried. Was this the key? Her fingers traced the name beneath it, Sarah Pembroke. That name she knew. Sarah Pembroke had been housekeeper at the vicarage in Rupert Abbott's time, a respectable woman, yet one who had left St. Mary Mead rather suddenly. A departure that had, at the time, raised few questions. But now, tucked between the brittle pages, Miss Marple found something else. A letter. The paper was delicate with age, yet the ink remained dark. She unfolded it with care. The matter must not be spoken of. What is done is done. We cannot afford further shame. No signature. Miss Marple sat back, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Secrets rarely stayed buried forever. They had a way of clawing their way to the surface, disrupting the carefully arranged lives of those who had long since moved on. And now, Peter Abbott was dead. A man with no known enemies. A quiet, retired schoolmaster. A man whose family had seemingly vanished from the village's consciousness until now. She closed the ledger and smoothed her skirt as she stood. This was no crime of sudden passion. This was something older, colder. A vendetta playing out after years of silence. And Peter Abbott, she suspected, had not been the intended target at all. He was simply the first thread pulled in a tapestry of old sins. She needed to speak with Dolly Bantry. And quickly. By late afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at the ivy-covered cottage on the edge of the village. The scent of wood smoke hung in the crisp air, mingling with the last traces of fallen leaves. Time was running out. The faint scent of overgrown lavender drifted from the untended garden as Miss Marple rapped briskly on the door. She stepped back, listening to the slow, measured shuffle of footsteps inside. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Edith Phelps, one of St. Mary Mead's oldest residents and, as Miss Marple well knew, one of its most steadfast keepers of inconvenient history. Edith had the air of a woman who had once been formidable, now softened by age but certainly not by temperament. Sharp blue eyes studied her visitor, narrowing slightly. "Well, if it isn't Jane Marple," she said dryly. "Come about him, have you?" Miss Marple smiled, the sort of smile one gives when they are entirely unsurprised to have been expected. If by him you mean Peter Abbott, then yes, my dear. And may I just say how lovely your roses are looking. I do so admire the way they thrive, even when left mostly to their own devices. Edith snorted but stepped aside. Come in, then. But don't go talking nonsense about my garden, it's a disgrace, and I know it. The cottage's interior was much like its owner, stubbornly resistant to modernity. Heavy furniture loomed in the dim light, a grandfather clock ticked in the corner, and a single coal fire burned low in the hearth. A silver tray sat nearby, holding a half-empty teacup, suggesting Edith had been in the middle of an afternoon's contemplation. Miss Marple allowed herself to be directed to an armchair, settling in with as much grace as one might when perching on something last reupholstered in 1875. Folding her hands neatly in her lap, she asked gently, "You knew Rupert Abbott, did you not?" Edith gave her a long, assessing look before saying, "Knew him. Everyone knew him. The vicar's son, charming as the devil. Always had a way about him. And, like the devil, he got himself into trouble he couldn't talk his way out of." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "The matter of the missing church funds." Edith let out a dry laugh. "Oh, there was more than just missing money, my dear. There was a missing future. A missing life." Miss Marple said nothing, simply letting the silence stretch. She had long since learned that silence, when applied correctly, could become unbearable for those who carried secrets. Edith sighed. Sarah Pembroke. She was the real scandal, though no one wanted to admit it. The name was not unexpected, but Miss Marple raised her brows slightly, encouraging her to continue. Edith shook her head. She was the housekeeper's niece. Came to stay when she was barely 17. A pretty girl. Clever. But from the wrong sort of family. Too ambitious for her own good, some said. A wry smile ghosted across her lips. Too trusting, if you ask me. Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly against the edge of her handbag. She trusted Rupert Abbott. Edith's expression turned bitter. Trusted, she repeated. Loved. Same thing in the end. She exhaled, rubbing her hands together as if trying to dispel an unpleasant memory. She was ruined, of course. You could see it plain as day. And then, all of a sudden, Rupert Abbott was gone. Just packed up and left overnight. No explanation, no farewell. Miss Marple hesitated before asking, softly, and Sarah? Edith's gaze darkened. Gone too. Not long after. Sent away, they said. A quiet arrangement, as they used to do. And just like that, it was as if neither of them had ever existed. The village got on with its business, as it always does. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. Then, after a moment, she asked, "Do you believe Sarah left of her own accord?" Edith's mouth tightened. Let's just say that in those days, young women didn't get many choices in such matters. The fire crackled, sending up a sudden flare of light that cast flickering shadows across Edith's lined face. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Miss Phelps," she said gently, "do you believe that someone has not forgotten?" Edith's sharp blue eyes met hers. "My dear Jane," she said, her voice low, "no one ever forgets." A hush settled between them, the only sound the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Miss Marple, ever the picture of politeness, took a final sip of her tea before setting the cup back onto the tray with deliberate care. "Yes," she murmured, more to herself than to her host. "That is precisely what I was afraid of."